The dust of Clearwater hung in the air, a fine red powder that coated everything, including the inside of Jackson Wade's mouth. He stood on the railway platform, hat pulled low, a man carved from the same hard land he worked. He was waiting. At 32, waiting was a skill he'd mastered. He'd waited for rain, waited for stampedes to tire, waited for the sun to break over a cold camp. But this was different. This waiting felt like standing on a cliff edge in the dark. The 315 from Kansas City was pulling a woman he'd never seen before. A woman who would be his wife by sundown. Eleanor Prescott. The name was as delicate as the picture his cousin Martha had painted. Quiet, modest, proper. A woman to smooth the rough edges of his life, to keep the house, to be a silent, steady presence in the background. A port in the storm of a lonely existence. He'd asked for quiet. He'd prayed for peace. The train whistle was a scream that tore the afternoon in two. Iron wheels shrieked, black smoke billowed, and the ground trembled. Jackson's heart wasn't beating, it was hammering, a frantic drum against his ribs. The train hissed to a stop, and the world exploded into motion. Businessmen in city suits, mothers with screaming children. A pair of saloon girls whose laughter was as loud and cheap as their perfume. Jackson's eyes scanned the chaos, searching for a ghost, a description on a piece of paper. And then he saw her. She stepped from the carriage, and for a second, the whole dusty station seemed to hold its breath. She was exactly as promised. Dark hair pinned tight in a proper bonnet, a dress the color of a stormy sky, buttoned right to her throat. She was an Eastern lady, a porcelain doll untouched by the grit and sun of the frontier. She was perfect. She was exactly what he'd ordered. But then she lifted her head, and Jackson's world tilted on its axis. Her eyes weren't demure. They weren't shy. They were green, the impossible green of new spring grass, and they held a fire that could burn a man to cinders. It was the look of a trapped wolf, a Mustang that had felt a bridle but never, ever been broken. Her gaze swept the crowd not with uncertainty, but with the sharp, calculating assessment of a general surveying a battlefield. She was looking for something, or someone. Their eyes met across the platform, and the world fell silent. He expected her to look away, to blush and lower her gaze as a proper woman should. She did not. She held his stare, her head tilting just so, and he felt like a horse being sized up at auction. A flicker of something crossed her face. Not a smile, but something sharper, like amusement or irony. She was the one in charge of this moment, not him. And then her voice cut through the noise, clear and strong, with no hint of a tremor. "Mr. Wade." It wasn't a question, it was a summons. Jackson felt a jolt, as if he'd been sleeping and someone had thrown cold water on his face. He straightened up, pulling his hat from his head, his manners kicking in even as his mind reeled. "Yes, ma'am." "Miss Prescott." Her lips curved, but the smile never reached those terrifying green eyes. "Eleanor," she corrected, stepping forward and extending a gloved hand. He took it, expecting a delicate, fragile thing. Her grip was anything but. It was firm, strong, the grip of someone who knew how to hold on. "I trust you received my letter, the one about the arrangements." He nodded, his throat suddenly dry as the dust around them. "Yes, ma'am. The Reverend is waiting." He had pictured this 1,000 times, a shy greeting, a quiet ride to the church. He had not pictured this woman, this presence that felt less like a bride and more like a storm front rolling in. She turned her head, taking in the dusty street, the sagging saloon, the whole of Clearwater in one sweeping, dismissive glance. "It's smaller than I imagined." The words held a faint, biting edge. "It's growing," Jackson said, the defensiveness in his own voice surprising him. "We got a new schoolhouse." She gave him that same polite, empty smile. "How progressive." Before he could figure out if he was being insulted, she turned her attention to the baggage car. "Shall we collect my trunk? I assume you're eager to complete the formalities." Formalities. The word stung more than he cared to admit. He just nodded and waved over young Tom Brennan to help. But as Tom wrestled with her luggage, Jackson noticed something strange. For a lady traveling all the way from the east, she was traveling light. One single, modest trunk. It seemed far too small to hold the life of the woman he was supposed to be building a future with. As they loaded it onto his wagon, her eyes were everywhere. She clocked the cowboys lounging outside the saloon, their lazy stares. She noted the townswomen whispering behind their fans, their sharp, judgmental glances. She didn't shrink from their attention. She met it head on, her chin held high. She missed nothing. She was like a hawk, perched and watching, and Jackson had the unnerving feeling that he was the mouse. The ride to the church was a strange, tense silence. Eleanor sat bolt upright on the wagon seat, her hands folded in her lap, her face a perfect, unreadable mask. But Jackson saw the tiny, repetitive clenching of her gloved fingers. She wasn't calm. She was coiled, a spring wound so tight it was ready to shatter. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was sudden and direct. "My cousin Martha spoke very highly of you," Jackson grunted, keeping his eyes on the horses. "She's a good woman, but she tends to paint a rosy picture." "She said you were honest," Eleanor said, turning those piercing green eyes on him. "She said you were a man who kept his word." Her stare was so intense it felt like a physical weight. "That matters more than the size of your herd, Mr. Wade. It matters more than anything." A chill crawled up Jackson's spine. This wasn't a bride making pleasant conversation. This was an interrogation. This was a woman setting terms. This wasn't the life he'd planned. This was something else entirely. The ceremony was a blur. Reverend Morrison, a man more comfortable with scripture than with people, fumbled his way through the vows. His wife and the town clerk stood as witnesses, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Jackson's own words felt like swallowing sand. But when it was Eleanor's turn, her voice was clear and steady as a bell. She spoke the vows without a single hesitation, her eyes locked on his, never once wavering. It didn't feel like she was making a promise. It felt like she was signing a contract he hadn't fully read. Then the Reverend announced, "You may kiss the bride." For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Jackson hesitated, but she didn't. She simply tilted her chin up, a silent command. He leaned in, and the kiss was brief, dry, and utterly devoid of warmth. It wasn't an act of submission. It was an act of permission. She had allowed it. And just as he pulled back, her eyes flickered. Just for a second. They darted toward the church doors at the back of the room, a quick, nervous glance, as if she were expecting someone to burst in and object. The moment passed in an instant, but it was enough. Jackson's blood ran cold. Who was she looking for? The wagon ride to the ranch felt 100 miles long. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and red. But Jackson felt none of its warmth. Eleanor sat beside him, a statue of composure, her face turned toward the vast, empty landscape. She wasn't admiring the view. She was studying it. Her eyes moved with a restless energy, tracing the lines of the hills, noting the dry creek beds, mapping the terrain. It wasn't the idle curiosity of a newcomer. It was the careful observation of a soldier entering enemy territory. "Are your neighbors close?" she asked suddenly, her voice sharp. "Closest is the Miller place, 5 miles east," Jackson answered, unsettled by the question. "Why?" She ignored him. "And the law? Is there a sheriff in Clearwater?" "Sheriff Brody. He's a good man, but he's got a lot of ground to cover." "So a man could get lost out here," she mused, more to herself than to him. "And it might be a long while before anyone came looking." A knot of dread tightened in Jackson's stomach. These were not the questions of a mail-order bride hoping to make new friends. These were the questions of a fugitive. As the ranch came into view, a small, sturdy log house against the endless sky, Jackson felt a pang of inadequacy. "It's not much," he said, the words feeling clumsy, "but the roof don't leak." She turned to look at him then, and for the first time, something in her expression softened. A genuine light sparked in her eyes. "It's perfect," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You built this yourself?" He nodded, caught off guard by her sincerity. "Some help from neighbors." When they stopped, He jumped down and came around to help her. As his hands circled her waist to lift her from the wagon, he felt it again. A surprising strength, a solidness beneath the fabric of her proper dress. The scent of lavender from her clothes mingled with something wilder, something like sagebrush after a storm. Inside, the house felt small and rough, filled with furniture he'd built with his own two hands. He expected a look of disappointment, a flicker of East Coast disdain. Instead, she moved through the single room with a quiet, purposeful authority, touching the rough-hewn table, running a hand along the stone of the fireplace. She was claiming the space. "I'll start supper," she announced, pulling off her gloves as if she'd been doing it in this very kitchen her whole life. "Bacon, beans, cornmeal," he found himself saying, feeling like a guest in his own home. She simply nodded and got to work, moving with an efficiency that was both impressive and deeply unsettling. This was not the woman he was promised. This was not the woman he thought he knew. And he was beginning to suspect that Eleanor Prescott was a name for a ghost. They ate in silence. The only sounds the scrape of forks on tin plates and the lonely cry of a coyote in the distance. The lamplight cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the small cabin feel even more isolated. Jackson watched her over the rim of his coffee cup. She ate with a focus he'd never seen, as if every bite was fuel for a long journey. Her eyes, when they met his, were not shy or inviting. They were watchful, filled with a restless energy that vibrated in the quiet air between them. He had wanted peace. He had wanted a simple life. He had married a mystery, and the silence in this room was louder than a gunshot. After the plates were cleared, they stood awkwardly by the open door of the small bedroom. His bedroom, their bedroom, the reality of it crashed down on him. This stranger, this woman of secrets, would share his bed. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. "I know this is all sudden. If you need some time to adjust." He trailed off, not knowing what he was offering. She stepped closer, and the lamplight caught in her eyes, turning them to molten gold. Her voice was low and firm, stripping away any last pretense of the demure bride. "Mr. Wade, you have made some very serious assumptions about the kind of woman you married." Before he could form a single word in response, she reached up and began to pull the pins from her hair. One by one, they came free, and a cascade of dark, heavy waves tumbled over her shoulders, down her back. The sight of it, so wild and unrestrained, stole the air from his lungs. Her smile was no longer polite. It was a dare, a challenge, a slow, dangerous curve of her lips that made the hair on his arms stand up. "You wanted a quiet wife," she whispered, the sound a silken threat. "But you should have asked yourself, what kind of quiet woman would travel 1,000 miles to marry a man she's never met, in a land where she knows no one?" He had no answer. He could only stare as she walked not to the bed, but to her small, unassuming trunk. She knelt and unfastened the latches. The lid creaked open. There was no fine linen, no delicate nightgowns, no treasured keepsakes from a life left behind. There was only a worn leather gun belt, coiled like a snake, and nestled within it, the dark polished wood and blued steel of a Colt peacemaker. She lifted it from the trunk, the weapon looking impossibly natural in her hand. She turned to face him, the revolver held loosely at her side, her eyes burning with an intensity that pinned him to the spot. "My name is not Eleanor Prescott," she said, her voice as cold and hard as the barrel of the gun. "Eleanor is dead, and the man who killed her thinks I am too." Jackson's mind went blank. The quiet cabin, his sanctuary, suddenly felt like a trap. The fire in the hearth crackled, oblivious to the fact that his entire world had just been set ablaze. He stared at the gun in her hand, then at her face. The polite bride was gone, stripped away to reveal this stranger with a story of death on her lips. "Who are you?" he finally managed to ask, his voice a rough whisper. "My name is Lena," she said. "Lena Caldwell. Eleanor was my cousin. We were raised like sisters." She walked to the table and placed the Colt down, with a heavy, deliberate thud. The sound echoed in the silence. "We were supposed to travel west together. She was to marry you. I was to find work in a bigger town, maybe San Antonio. A new start for both of us." her hands clenched into fists on the tabletop. But we never made it out of Kentucky. Jackson sank onto a nearby stool, his legs suddenly refusing to hold him. He listened as she spoke, her voice flat and devoid of emotion, as if she were reciting a story that had happened to someone else. She told him about her uncle, Eleanor's father, a man who bred the finest horses in the state, and she told him about another man, Samuel Garrett, a wealthy, powerful neighbor with a hunger for land and a soul as black as coal. Garrett had wanted her uncle's ranch. He'd made offers, then threats. When her uncle refused to sell, Garrett had decided to take it. Lena's voice caught for the first time. I was in the stables. I saw it all. Garrett and his men, they didn't just... They made it look like a robbery. They shot my uncle. When Eleanor ran out screaming, She stopped, her eyes closing for a brief, painful second. They shot her too. They left them both in the dirt. The silence that followed was heavy with the ghosts of that day. They thought I was in the house. They set it on fire to destroy the evidence, to make it look like I burned with it. I hid in the hayloft until they rode off. I buried them myself under the old oak tree. She looked at Jackson then, her green eyes shimmering with unshed tears, but her voice was pure steel. Garrett took everything. The land, the horses. He paid off the law. The official story is that a fire took the whole family. But I knew. I was the only one left who knew the truth. She took a deep breath. I found Eleanor's things, the train ticket, the letters from your cousin, your name. It was my only chance. To disappear, to become someone else, somewhere no one would ever think to look for a dead girl. So I became Eleanor Prescott. Jackson stared at her, at Lena, a woman who had walked out of a nightmare and into his home. Every piece of his simple, quiet future lay shattered on the floor. He'd been lied to, used. His ranch wasn't a home, it was a hideout. He was not a husband, he was a cover story. Anger, hot and sharp, flared in his chest. He stood up, the legs of the stool scraping against the wooden floor. So you brought this death sentence to my doorstep? You think you can just hide here, and this Garrett won't come looking? Lena's chin lifted, a spark of defiance in her eyes. He thinks I'm dead. He has no reason to look for me. People like that always have reasons, Jackson shot back, his voice rising. A loose end, a whisper, a rumor. You think a man who murders a family for land is just going to forget? He paced the small room like a caged animal. I wanted a wife, a partner, not a war. And what was I supposed to do? She cried, her own voice cracking with the strain. Let him win? Let him get away with it? I had nowhere else to go. This was the only hope I had left. They stood facing each other, two strangers bound by a lie, the air between them crackling with anger and fear. He could throw her out. He could ride to the sheriff in the morning and tell him everything. He could wash his hands of this mess, send this ghost on her way, and try to reclaim the peaceful life he'd lost the moment she stepped off that train. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the tremor in her hands that she tried so desperately to hide. He saw the sheer, unyielding will that had carried her 1,000 miles from her own personal hell. She was a survivor, and he had stood in a church that very afternoon and sworn before God to honor and protect her. It didn't matter what name she used. He had given his word. His gut twisted. His cousin had said he was an honest man, a man who kept his word. And Lena, Eleanor, whoever she was, had gambled her entire life on that one fact. Jackson stopped pacing. He took a long, slow breath, the scent of wood smoke filling his lungs. He walked back to the table and looked down at the Colt peacemaker lying there. Then he looked at her. Go get some sleep, he said, his voice quiet but firm. You're safe here tonight. Her eyes widened in disbelief. You're not. I made a vow, he cut in, his voice rough. You're my wife. That makes your trouble my trouble. He picked up the gun from the table, tested its weight in his hand, then laid it back down. Tomorrow, he said, meeting her astonished gaze, you're going to teach me how to fight a war. The sun rose the next morning on a world that was fundamentally changed. Jackson woke before dawn, the habit of a lifetime. But for the first time, he wasn't alone in his house. He moved quietly, stoking the fire. But he knew the moment she woke. He didn't hear a sound, but he felt it. A shift in the air. The return of that coiled, watchful energy. When he turned from the fireplace, she was sitting up in the bed. The blankets pulled to her chin, her dark hair a wild tangle around her shoulders. Her eyes were clear and sharp. There was no trace of the frightened refugee from the night before. This was a soldier ready for a new day. "The coffee's on," he said gruffly, not knowing what else to say. She nodded and slipped out of bed. He'd expected her to appear in her proper traveling dress, a reminder of the lie she'd been living. He was wrong. 10 minutes later, she walked out of the bedroom wearing a pair of his old work trousers, cinched at the waist with a piece of rope, and one of his shirts, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. The city lady was gone. In her place was someone who looked ready for anything. She picked up a tin cup of coffee and took a sip, her eyes never leaving his. "So," she said, her voice all business, "about that war." The day was a revelation. He'd thought he was offering her a sanctuary. He quickly realized she was the one with the skills to keep them alive. They walked the perimeter of his land, and she saw it not as a ranch, but as a fortress with critical weaknesses. "This gully here," she said, pointing to a dry wash that ran 100 yards from the house. "A man could crawl up it completely unseen. We need to clear the brush, set up some kind of warning, a tripwire with some tin cans maybe." Jackson, who had ridden this land his entire life, had only ever seen it as a place for his cattle to graze. Lena saw sightlines, ambush points, and fields of fire. She handled his Winchester rifle with a familiarity that spoke of long practice. She took him to a small canyon and set up targets. He was a decent shot, good enough for hunting. She was better. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled, her movements economical and precise. She could reload faster than he could, and her shots were grouped in tight, lethal patterns. "My uncle taught me," she explained, her face unreadable as she squinted down the barrel. "He always said a woman in Kentucky needed to know how to handle more than just a needle and thread." The town gossip he'd worried about yesterday seemed like a foolish, distant concern. What would Mary Hendricks and the other church ladies say now if they could see the mail-order bride teaching their toughest cowboy how to properly defend his own home? Days bled into weeks. A strange new routine settled over the ranch. By day they were partners in a silent, desperate preparation. They dug a new root cellar with a concealed entrance from inside the cabin, a place to hide, a bolt hole if the worst happened. They reinforced the doors and shuttered the windows with heavy wooden bars that could be dropped into place in seconds. They spent hours practicing with the rifles until Jackson could reload in his sleep and hit a silver dollar at 50 paces. But it was more than just a military drill. In between the grim preparations, a different kind of partnership began to form. She worked alongside him, her initial awkwardness with ranch chores quickly giving way to a fierce competence. She learned to mend fences, her hands blistering and then hardening without a single complaint. She learned the rhythms of the cattle, the signs of a coming storm, the language of the land. She was a fast learner, driven by a relentless energy that both exhausted and inspired him. She was no longer just the ghost of Eleanor Prescott. She was Lena, a woman of impossible strength and hidden sorrows. At night they would sit by the fire, the silence between them no longer tense and angry, but filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. Sometimes she would talk, telling him stories of her childhood in Kentucky, of the horses she'd loved, of the cousin who had been her other half. In these moments her guard would drop, and he would see the vulnerable young woman beneath the hardened soldier. And Jackson, a man who had never been good with words, found himself talking too. He told her about his own lonely upbringing, his dream of building something that would last, something of his own. He was admitting to a stranger the things he'd never even admitted to himself. He had ordered a wife from a catalog expecting a quiet servant. Instead, he'd found an equal. One evening after a long day of hauling water from the nearly dry creek bed, she looked at him across the fire, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes weary but clear. "You could have thrown me out, Jackson," she said softly. "Why didn't you?" He looked at her, at this woman who had turned his world upside down and, somehow, impossibly, made it feel more real than it ever had before. "I told you," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "I keep my word." She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she gave him a small, genuine smile. It was the first one he'd ever seen, and it hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was in that moment he knew. He was no longer just protecting a stranger. He was protecting his wife. And he would see Samuel Garrett in hell before he let the man touch her. The whispers started the first time they rode into Clearwater for supplies. It wasn't just that his new bride wore trousers, though that was enough to set tongues wagging. It was the way she carried herself. She walked with a purpose, her eyes constantly scanning, her hand never straying far from the colt that was now a permanent fixture on her hip. She wasn't afraid, and that, more than anything, seemed to offend the town's sensibilities. Mary Hendricks, the self-appointed queen of local gossip, cornered Jackson by the feed store. "Jackson, a word," she began, her voice dripping with false concern. "People are talking. Your new wife. It isn't proper. A woman with a gun on her hip, wearing men's clothing. It's an embarrassment." Jackson just looked at her, his face a granite mask. "Mary, my wife can wear whatever she pleases, and if any of you had half her courage, this town would be a damn sight safer." He walked away, leaving her sputtering in indignation. But the encounter left a bitter taste in his mouth. These people, his neighbors, they had no idea what was coming. They lived in a world of church socials and quilting bees, blind to the wolves that prowled just beyond the edge of their comfortable lives. Lena, for her part, seemed completely immune to their judgment. She met their stares with a cool indifference that only fueled their gossip. But she wasn't just ignoring them. She was watching them. She saw the fear in the eyes of the other ranch wives, women whose husbands were gone for weeks on cattle drives, leaving them isolated and vulnerable. She saw the dismissive way the men treated them, as if they were little more than domestic servants. One afternoon, she saw young Tom Brennan's wife, Sarah, with a fresh bruise on her cheek, trying to hide it behind a fallen strand of hair. The next day, Lena rode out to the Brennan place. Jackson didn't know what she said, but when she came back hours later, there was a new, determined set to her jaw. A week later, Sarah Brennan showed up at their ranch, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute. "Mrs. Wade," she said, her voice trembling, can you teach me to shoot?" That was the beginning. Sarah was the first. Soon another wife came, then two more. They would meet in secret, out in the canyons far from the prying eyes of the town. Lena was a patient, demanding teacher. She taught them how to load, how to aim, how to stand their ground. She taught them that a rifle wasn't just a man's tool, it was an equalizer. Jackson would watch from a distance, a strange mix of pride and apprehension swelling in his chest. He was witnessing a quiet, radical rebellion, led by the woman he had married by accident. She wasn't just building a fortress for themselves. She was building an army. The summer was brutal. The sun baked the land until it cracked and split like old leather. The creek dried up completely, leaving behind a ribbon of baked mud and bleached stones. The grass turned brown and brittle, and the cattle grew thin, their ribs showing through their hides. The drought was a slow, relentless killer, strangling the life from the prairie. Every day was a battle for water. Jackson and Lena hauled barrels from the river, a back-breaking 10-mile round trip. They worked side by side from sunup to sundown, their bodies aching, their faces caked in dust. The hardship forged a new kind of intimacy between them, a bond built on shared sweat and silent struggle. They were a team, a single unit fighting a common enemy. Despair was a constant visitor. They lost 2 calves in 1 week, their small bodies frail and still in the parched fields. Jackson saw Lena cry for the first time then, silent tears tracking clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, the soldier's armor finally cracking to reveal the grieving woman beneath. "We could leave," he said softly into her hair, hating the words even as he spoke them. "Go somewhere else. California, maybe." She pulled back, her eyes flashing with a familiar fire, even through the tears. "No, I'm not running anymore, Jackson. This is our home. We don't run from a fight. Not from men, and not from the sky." Her resolve strengthened his own. They dug the well deeper, chasing the water table as it retreated into the earth. They sold off a third of the herd for a fraction of its worth, just to have enough cash to buy feed. They fought for every single life, human and animal, on their small patch of land. They were surviving, but just barely. And then, one blistering afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon. He wasn't a neighbor. He rode an expensive black stallion, and he wore the clothes of a wealthy man, his suit impossibly clean in the dusty landscape. He rode with an air of arrogant ownership, as if the whole parched prairie already belonged to him. A cold, sick feeling settled in the pit of Jackson's stomach. He knew, even before the man was close enough to see his face, who it was. The rider pulled up in front of the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the struggling ranch with open contempt. He was handsome in a cruel sort of way, with cold, calculating eyes and a thin, predatory smile. Jackson stepped off the porch, his hand resting near the butt of his own revolver. Lena was just inside the doorway, hidden in the shadows, but he could feel her presence, a silent, deadly stillness. The man dismounted, his smile widening. "Jackson Wade?" he asked, his voice smooth and oily. "My name is Samuel Garrett. I've been acquiring some of the neighboring properties. Given the drought, I'm making a fair offer to help folks out." It was him. The devil had ridden into their sanctuary. Jackson's blood turned to ice. He could feel Lena behind him, her breath catching in a small, sharp gasp. He had to keep her hidden. He had to get this man off his land before he saw her. "Not interested," Jackson said, his voice flat and hard. Garrett's smile didn't falter. "Don't be hasty, Mr. Wade. I've seen your herd. I've seen your well. You're on your last legs. I'm offering you a clean slate, enough cash to start over somewhere greener." He gestured around at the scorched earth. "There's no future here. I'm doing you a favor." "I like it here just fine," Jackson said, his knuckles white where he gripped the porch railing. "Now, I'd thank you to get off my property." Garrett's eyes narrowed, the friendly mask slipping for a moment to reveal the predator beneath. "A man of pride, I can respect that. But pride doesn't fill a belly, Wade, and it certainly won't protect that pretty new wife I hear you have." He took a step toward the house, his eyes probing the darkness of the doorway. "They say she's a real firecracker. Maybe I should make my offer to her. Women can be so much more practical." That was it. Jackson moved, stepping in front of the doorway, blocking Garrett's view completely. "That's enough," he snarled. "You leave her out of this." Garrett laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Protective, I like that. But you can't protect her from starvation, Wade. Sell to me. It's your only option." And then, a voice from the shadows of the cabin, a voice that was pure ice. "He's right, Jackson." Lena stepped out of the doorway and into the blinding sunlight. She wasn't wearing a bonnet or an apron. She was wearing his trousers and shirt, the gun belt strapped to her hips, her hair braided back like a warrior's. She walked forward until she was standing beside Jackson, her green eyes fixed on Samuel Garrett's face. Garrett stared at her, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He saw a rancher's wife, dressed strangely, but nothing more. "See?" Garrett said with a smirk. "The lady has sense." Lena's lips curved into a smile that was all teeth. "It's been a long time, Samuel." She said his name, and the world seemed to stop. The smirk on Garrett's face vanished, replaced by a wave of shock, then disbelief, then pure, unadulterated rage. Recognition dawned in his cold eyes. He wasn't looking at a rancher's wife. He was looking at a ghost. He was looking at the one loose end he thought he had buried and burned. "You," he breathed, the single word dripping with venom. "It can't be." "You should have made sure I was in the house before you lit the match," Lena said, her voice deadly calm. Garrett's hand instinctively went for the pistol on his hip, but Jackson's was already drawn and leveled at his chest. "I wouldn't," Jackson warned, his voice a low growl. Garrett froze, his face a mask of fury. He looked from Lena to Jackson, his mind clearly racing, putting the pieces together. The mail-order bride, the disappearance, the remote, isolated ranch. It was the perfect hiding place. "You clever little bitch," he spat at Lena. "You think this cowboy can protect you? I own this valley. I own the law. You have nowhere left to run." "I'm not running anymore," Lena said, her hand now resting on the butt of her own Colt. This is my home, and you're trespassing." Garrett backed away slowly, his eyes burning with a murderous promise. He swung himself onto his horse, his face twisted in a hateful sneer. "This isn't over," he snarled. "I will burn this place to the ground with both of you inside. I will finish what I started." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of red dust hanging in the air like a bloody shroud. The immediate threat was gone, but they both knew. The war had just begun. The aftermath of Garrett's visit was a heavy, suffocating silence. The sun beat down. The air was still, but the peace of the valley was gone, replaced by the chilling certainty of what was to come. Garrett wasn't a man who made idle threats. He had found them, and he would be back. "We have to leave," Jackson said that night, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "He knows where we are now. We can pack the wagon, be gone by morning, head north." Lena was cleaning her rifle by the firelight, her movements swift and sure. She didn't even look up. "No. Lena, be reasonable. He said he owns the law here. We can't fight him alone." "First, I'm not running," she said, sliding a freshly oiled bolt back into place with a satisfying click. "I did that once. Never again. Second," she finally looked at him, her eyes glowing in the firelight. "Who said we're alone?" The next morning she rode out, not towards clear water but towards the scattered ranches hidden in the folds of the prairie. She went first to Sarah Brennan's place, then to the Millers, then to the wives of men who were away on a long cattle drive up to Kansas. She returned 2 days later, exhausted and covered in dust, but with a new light of determination in her eyes. The first sign that her plan was working came a week later. A small supply wagon, driven by Old Man Miller, trundled up to their ranch. It was loaded with sacks of flour, potatoes, and something even more precious, 3 barrels of water from his deep, spring-fed well. "The women folks sent this," he mumbled, refusing to meet Jackson's eye. "Said to tell you, they're with you." It was a lifeline. More supplies trickled in over the following weeks, delivered in secret, often at night. A crate of ammunition from the blacksmith, salted pork from the butcher's wife, a warning passed through Sarah Brennan that Garrett had hired a half-dozen rough-looking men, led by a vicious outlaw named Morrison. They weren't just a ranch couple anymore. They were the heart of a silent rebellion. Garrett's campaign of terror began subtly. A section of their fence was cut during the night, scattering a dozen head of cattle. A week later, they found their small vegetable garden trampled and ruined. It was war by 1,000 cuts, designed to wear them down, to isolate them, to make them feel helpless. But it had the opposite effect. Every act of aggression solidified the resolve of the women Lena had trained. They began to organize. They set up a system of lookouts, using mirrors to flash signals from one ridge to another across the valley. They created a network of riders, young boys mostly, who could carry messages between the ranches faster than Garrett's men could ride. The valley was no longer a collection of isolated homesteads. It was a community united against a common enemy. The tension was a living thing, a constant hum beneath the surface of daily life. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every distant rider a potential enemy. Jackson found he could barely sleep, his ears straining for the sound of approaching hoofbeats. But through it all, Lena was a rock. The fear she must have felt was buried deep beneath a layer of cold, hard resolve. She was no longer just fighting for her own life. She was fighting for the home they had built, for the husband who had stood by her, for the other women who had placed their trust in her. One night, as they lay in bed, the silence of the prairie pressing in on them, she turned to him. In the pale moonlight streaming through the window, he could see the vulnerability she kept so carefully hidden during the day. "Are you scared, Jackson?" she whispered. He thought for a moment. He was terrified. But it was a different kind of fear than he had ever known. "I'm not scared of them," he said, and he was surprised to find it was the truth. "I'm scared of losing this, of losing you." He reached out and brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. Her skin was warm, real. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. When she opened them again, they were shining. Without a word, she moved closer. In the space that had always existed between them, the last remnant of their strange beginnings finally dissolved. In the heart of the siege, surrounded by danger and uncertainty, They were no longer just partners in survival. They were husband and wife. A few weeks later, the ground shifted beneath their feet again. Lena had been quiet for days, a thoughtful, inward-looking expression on her face. One morning, as Jackson was cleaning his rifle, she stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. "Jackson," she said, her voice soft but steady, "I'm pregnant." The words hit Jackson like a physical blow. Pregnant. A baby. In the middle of a war zone. His first feeling was a surge of pure, primal joy, so intense it almost brought him to his knees. A child. His and Lena's. A symbol of the life they were building against all odds. But hot on its heels came a wave of crushing, paralyzing fear. A child was not a soldier. A child was hope, but it was also the ultimate vulnerability. "We have to send you away," he said immediately, his mind racing, "to San Antonio, to my cousin Martha, somewhere safe. I'll deal with Garrett." Lena's expression hardened. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice low and fierce. "Don't you dare try to send me away. Do you think I'm weaker now? I'm stronger. I'm not just fighting for me anymore. I'm fighting for our child, for their right to be born free in their own home." "But Lena, it's too dangerous." "Life is dangerous," she shot back, stepping into the room, her eyes blazing. "You think I'd be safer on a stagecoach, a target for any one of Garrett's men? You think I could live with myself, hiding 1,000 miles away while you fought our battle alone? This is our stand, Jackson. Together. Always together." He looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, the unshakable certainty in her stance. She was right. Their fate was tied to this land, to this fight. To run would be to lose everything they had become. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, burying his face in her hair. "Okay," he whispered. "Together." The news of the pregnancy spread through the women's network like wildfire. It transformed the fight. It was no longer about defending property or even their own lives. It was about the future. It was about defending the world their children would inherit. The women's support, once covert, became bold. Mary Hendricks, the former town gossip, became Lena's most fervent and loyal lieutenant. She organized the other women, drilling them relentlessly, turning them into a disciplined, formidable militia. The men of Clearwater, including Sheriff Brody, were largely oblivious. They saw a group of women spending more time together and dismissed it as sewing circles and social gatherings. They had no idea that beneath the placid surface of their town, a revolution was brewing. Garrett and his hired gun, Morrison, escalated their attacks. They tried to burn their barn one night, but a volley of rifle fire from 3 different directions sent them scattering back into the darkness. They tried to ambush Jackson on his way back from the river, only to find themselves caught in a crossfire, pinned down by Sarah Brennan and 2 of the Miller women until they were forced to retreat. Lena, despite Jackson's protests, refused to stay behind. She directed the defense with the calm authority of a seasoned general. Her pregnancy didn't slow her down. It seemed to sharpen her focus, to fuel her resolve. She was a force of nature, a mother protecting her young, and she was terrifyingly effective. Winter approached, and the tension in the valley was stretched to the breaking point. Garrett was growing more desperate, his campaign of harassment failing to break them. They knew he was planning something big, a final, decisive blow. The sky grew heavy and gray, the air turning sharp with the promise of snow. A sense of impending doom hung over the ranch. And then, one afternoon, as the first fat, wet snowflakes began to drift down from the sky, Lena clutched her belly and cried out. "Jackson," she gasped, her face pale, sweat beading on her forehead. "It's time." The world outside dissolved into a blur of white. The snow came down not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding sheet, driven by a howling wind that rattled the very bones of the cabin. The blizzard was a monster, swallowing the prairie, erasing the world. And inside, a new storm was raging. Lena's labor was hard and fast. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped Jackson's heart. Doc Henley was in Clearwater, 10 miles away, an impossible distance. It was just them, alone in the storm, with a baby coming too soon and an army of killers on its way. He worked on instinct, his hands shaking as he gathered clean sheets and boiled water. He remembered delivering calves in blinding rain, foals on freezing nights. But this was Lena. This was his child. The stakes were impossibly high. Hours bled together in a haze of pain and prayer. Lena was a warrior, fighting with every ounce of her strength, her hand gripping his until his knuckles were white. He coached her, whispered to her, held her, pouring all of his love and hope into his touch, his voice. Outside, another sound began to cut through the howl of the wind. Gunshots, sharp, cracking reports, muffled by the snow. They were here. Garrett and his men were using the cover of the blizzard to launch their final assault. Jackson's blood ran cold. He was trapped. He grabbed his Winchester, propping it by the door, his mind torn between the battle for life inside the cabin and the battle for death just beyond the walls. A bullet slammed into the heavy wooden door, making them both jump. More shots followed, splintering the window shutters. "They're trying to pin us down," Lena gritted out between contractions, her face slick with sweat. Jackson fired back through a crack in the shutters, the rifle bucking against his shoulder. He was firing blind into the swirling whiteness, trying to keep them at bay, trying to buy time. But how much time did they have? He was one man, and they were a dozen. He reloaded, his hands clumsy with haste, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm of terror. He looked at Lena, her face contorted in pain, and a wave of helpless rage washed over him. He had failed her. He had brought her to this remote place to keep her safe, and now he was going to watch her die. "Jackson," she screamed, her back arching. "The baby! It's coming now!" He dropped the rifle and rushed to her side. The world narrowed to the small bed, the flickering lamplight, the miracle and terror of birth. He forgot the gunfire, the blizzard, the men outside. There was only Lena and the new life fighting its way into their violent world. And then at the height of the storm, both inside and out, the cabin door exploded inward. Splinters of wood flew across the room as the heavy bar shattered. Framed in the doorway, covered in snow, stood Samuel Garrett. His face was a mask of triumphant hatred, a pistol in his hand. Behind him, Morrison and two other men spilled into the room, their guns raised. "End of the line, Wade," Garrett sneered, his eyes fixing on Lena on the bed. A cruel smile twisted his lips. "Looks like I came just in time for the party." Jackson stood, shielding Lena with his body, his own pistol coming up, but he knew it was hopeless. 4-1. He might take one of them with him, but he couldn't save her. He couldn't save their child. In that frozen moment, as Garrett raised his pistol to fire, two things happened at once. A small, furious cry erupted from the bed, the first defiant sound of a new life. And from outside, in the heart of the blizzard, all hell broke loose. A sudden, deafening volley of rifle fire erupted from all sides, a storm of lead that ripped through the night. One of the men behind Garrett screamed and collapsed, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Morrison staggered back, clutching a shattered shoulder. Garrett spun around, his face a mask of shocked confusion. "What is this? Who's out there?" But Jackson knew. It was Lena's army. It was Sarah Brennan and Mary Hendricks and the Miller women. They hadn't been caught unprepared. They had used the storm as their own cover, surrounding the cabin, waiting. The hunters had walked right into the perfect trap. Garrett, realizing he was surrounded, turned his fury back to the room. If he was going to die, he would take them with him. He lunged for the bed, his face a snarl of pure malice, his gun aimed at Lena and the tiny wailing infant in her arms. But he had underestimated the woman on the bed. He thought she was a victim, helpless and weak after childbirth. He was wrong. With a speed that defied her exhaustion, Lena moved. From under the blood-soaked sheets, her hand appeared, and in it was the Colt peacemaker she always kept close. Her eyes, burning with the fury of a she-bear defending her cub, met his. The world slowed. Jackson saw the flash. He heard the roar of the gun, deafening in the small cabin. He saw the look of utter surprise on Samuel Garrett's face as a red flower bloomed on his chest. Garrett staggered backward, his gun falling from his limp fingers. He looked down at the wound, then back at Lena, a look of disbelief on his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a gurgle of blood came out. Then he crashed to the floor, his reign of terror ending on the dirt floor of the house he had tried to destroy. Outside, the firing stopped. Morrison and the last man, seeing their leader fall, threw down their weapons and surrendered to the ghostly, snow-covered figures of the women who emerged from the blizzard, their rifles steady. The storm had broken. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the ragged gasps of Jackson's own breathing, and the strong, healthy cries of his newborn daughter. He rushed to the bed, his eyes drinking in the sight of them. Lena, pale, exhausted, but gloriously, fiercely alive, and bundled in her arms, a tiny, perfect child. A girl, Lena whispered, her voice trembling with emotion as she looked up at him, a radiant smile on her face. We have a daughter, Jackson. He fell to his knees beside the bed, tears he didn't know he had streaming down his face. He gently touched the baby's cheek, his rough, calloused finger impossibly large against her soft skin. He looked at his wife, this impossible, incredible woman who had faced down death and brought forth life in the same instant. The woman he loved more than life itself. We have a daughter, he repeated, his voice choked with awe. Together. The sun rose on a world washed clean. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of white that sparkled under a brilliant blue sky. The air was crisp and cold and utterly still. The war was over. Sheriff Brody and a posse of bewildered townsmen arrived mid-morning, guided by Mary Hendricks. They found a scene that would become the stuff of Clearwater legend. Samuel Garrett dead on the cabin floor, his remaining men bound and held under guard by a half-dozen grim-faced ranch wives holding rifles. The story that unfolded, of a mail-order bride who was actually a fugitive, of a land baron's murderous plot, and of the secret army of women who had saved them all, was almost too fantastic to believe. But the evidence was undeniable. The legend of Lena Wade, the ghost of Kentucky, was born. In the months that followed, the valley healed. With Garrett gone, the small ranchers were free from his threats. The community, forged in the fire of the siege, grew stronger than ever before. The women of Clearwater, having discovered their own strength, would never be the same. They walked with a new confidence. Their voices were heard in town meetings, and more than a few of them started wearing split skirts and carrying rifles as a matter of course. The Wade Ranch thrived. The rains returned in the spring, and the grass grew thick and green. They rebuilt the barn, bigger and stronger than before. Jackson and Lena, their partnership now sealed in blood and love, worked side by side, their silences comfortable, their words full of a deep, unspoken understanding. They named their daughter Hope. It was the only name that felt right. She was a child of the storm, a promise of a new beginning, a symbol of everything they had fought for. She grew with the wild, indomitable spirit of her mother, her laughter echoing across the prairie. 5 years later, Jackson stood on the porch, watching Hope, her dark hair a tangled mess, trying to climb the corral fence with a determination that was pure Lena. She was fearless, stubborn, and utterly magnificent. Lena came to stand beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. She's you, Jackson said, a smile in his voice, all fire and trouble. Lena laughed, a warm, easy sound. She's us, she corrected softly, wild and free, built to last. He thought back to that day on the train platform, to the quiet, simple life he had thought he wanted. He had asked for peace and had been given a war. He had asked for a quiet wife and had been given a revolution. It was the greatest bargain he had ever made. He turned and looked at his wife, at the green eyes that still held a wild, untamable fire, and his heart swelled with a love so vast it felt like it could fill the entire sky. Cowboy wanted a quiet wife, Lena teased, her voice a low murmur against his lips, their old private joke. Jackson smiled, leaning in to kiss her. Got a wild one who saved his life, he finished, and gave him everything that ever mattered. The West was still a wild, untamed place, but now so was his heart, and he wouldn't have it any other way. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the Wild West. Every story we tell is a testament to the resilience and courage of those who carved a life from the frontier. But now I want to hear from you. What part of Lena and Jackson's story resonated with you the most? Was it the moment she revealed her true identity, or the final stand in the blizzard? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps bring these stories to life for everyone. If you were captivated by this tale of love, danger, and survival, please consider hitting that subscribe button and ringing the notification bell. We have so many more stories from the untamed American frontier to share with you, filled with characters just as bold and unforgettable as Lena Wade. Sharing this video with a friend who loves a good Western is the best way to support our channel. Let's keep the spirit of the Old West alive together. Until next time, stay safe and keep listening for the stories the wind whispers across the plains.